Hello YouTubers, I was asked how I make this Vassal module, so I thought I'd kind of show you. So with Vassal, once you've got it loaded up, you can go into any module by right-clicking on it and selecting Edit, and what opens up is the Vassal module editor. And basically, this is the game. Now this what you see here in this list comes with some predefined things, and you can add and take away from them. For instance, it came with the help menu, the main menu, the game pieces, image definitions, global properties, game pieces, the dice, units on map, and the notes, I believe. And then the rest you have to add. For instance, in here I've added in the version history and the board game designer notes. And basically you just right click and it tells you the type of things you can add. Like you can add an HTML help file, an about screen, a tutorial, plain text, or an imported class. If you know how to do programming in Java, this would make your life a lot easier. But for those of us who don't know how to program in Java, this is something strange and unknown. But anyway, for instance, the help screen is the About Vassal one, but in the actual game, your About screen, or About module, is the graphic that you choose. And your version history, for instance, once you add the entry, you then select the file that you want it to be and give it a name. And if you actually then want to see it, you can go up in here and go version history, and there it opens up your window. Let me just drag it onto the left-hand monitor here, and there it all is, your text version history. Might help if I'm actually over on the left-hand side. So I've done 6 updates so far to the SFB Battles Cadet module. So that's what I do. So basically you just open up your general text editor, create your file and save it. So here it is, just a simple text editor, gedit for Linux. And I'm just going to fix this text file. For some reason it's gone off on the line spacing. There we go, and we save it. And then if we go back in and reselect it, open it up again, and go back up. Oops, I should have saved it. Save it. And then look at the version history. It's not as broken up as it was. Let's look at that again. We'll just verify where I'm saving this. So I am saving this under mods SFB Cadet mod. This is under Mods, SFB Cadet Mods. Select the file, open it, save it. There it is. But you would do the same thing with everything else. For your map, well, here, up here you can select add a map kind of thing. There is your map. Then inside that you can create other sections, like a deck of cards, etc. So if you say select a map board, that will come with some predefined things, or you can add a board or add an imported class. So I added a board, that's a blank. I added another board, grab nebula, but inside each one of these you then can add a hex grid or make it a rectangular grid or an irregular grid, etc. So I chose a hex grid, and then in the hex grid you can add grid numbering or simply go into the properties and set things. Hex height, hex width, snap to a fine point, edges or legal locations, etc. The drawing color, you can actually go in and you can edit the grid. You can set the grid spacing and the numbering, etc. Then if we double click on the grid numbering, it gives you more options. Now these are all predefined things that come with Vassal, the Vassal engine, but then you can modify them. So for instance here that's a blank map, but in this one, the Grab Nebula map, I actually selected an image. Whereas up here, the image is null. So it's a blank white background. So you can make various game boards, and these are selected from when you open up. You got stacking options for your counters. Let's see. A line of sight thread. You can set names to things. Add a zooming feature. So right now if I go into my maps, let me just open up a scenario 1. There is a zoom feature here, which lets me go up to 600. There's no reason for me to go to 600, so if I want to I could go back here, take out the 600, remove it, remove 500, remove 400, and I've got a, there's no 20%, so let me add 0.2 and click OK, and I'll save it. It takes a fair amount of time to save it because it's gotten to be a quite large module at this point. But anyway, now if I go back in here, there's no 4 or 5 or 600, it's only 300%. And as you can see, 300% is quite huge. And if I go, there's now 20%. So that's how you can make changes. But the heart of making a module comes down to game pieces. This is a predefined section. There's game piece prototype definitions. So if you know that on every game piece you want to be able to use the number pad, for instance, for movement, you can create a prototype definition called numpad, and you can create a bunch of triggering actions inside that definition. And then when it comes to actually making a counter, you can just simply put in numpad as a basic prototype that everybody has. Now, there is no numpad there, but if I go back up here to movement or rotation, it's one of these. I forget which. Now I remember, it's under ship. So I've created a definition called a ship versus a weapon versus a subship. These are things that, as we're going to label them in this module, Starfleet battles, you've got starships, and then you got weapons like missiles or drones, and you've got things that are not a ship but they're not a weapon, things like shuttles or a fighter or a PF. So I've created 3 classes, as it were. But anyway, in the ship definition, I've added the prototype numpad. So anything that's created and classed as a ship will have the numpad. And under weapon, you'll notice that numpad is not there. Or sorry, it is there. And I've done it as well for shuttles. So I can move all these types of pieces with the number pad. And if we go back up to your definition for numpad, if we look at the triggering action, so the description of this triggering action is to move forward. And what it does is it watches for these keystrokes. So if I hold down Control Shift and hit number pad 8, it will then perform the keystroke of Control F. And Control F is a basic move forward definition, where it will advance the piece 65 pixels. So this was a predefined setting that came with the game, so I just used it. But you could create others where you could say super movement, and that's Control Shift F. And instead of moving 65 pixels, it moves 130 pixels with one click. And then you could set up a number pad where it's maybe Control Shift 5. And if that's hit, it will then call out this function to do the 130 pixel movement. So these are types of prototypes. Another prototype I created was Spreadsheet, and Spreadsheet just comes up on Alt-S and it gives you a spreadsheet that is 80 rows by 21 columns. And if we actually look at this, it's not showing here. We basically have movement, moved, fired, and ship. So everything really is coming in through the ship definition because of the way I set up the prototypes. So if I look at the ship definition, I should have a prototype in here for Spreadsheet, and there it is. So starships can explode, so I created a triggering action called explode, or ship explosion, and it watches for the Control D keystroke and executes Control X. And somewhere I've got another definition for the Control X for an explosion. There it is here. So on the execution of Control X, it puts in this graphic with an area of effect. So it's partially opaque with a radius of 1 hex on the map. Anyway, I've created multiple races. So I have a Federation CA. If I really wanted to expand this module, I could create a Federation frigate, a Federation destroyer, Federation war destroyer, Federation like cruiser, Federation battlecruiser, Federation dreadnought, Federation battleship, etc. I could put in multiple counters for it. For instance, right now I'm just using a basic cartoon type counter for my pieces, but if I wanted to, I could come in here and go into my folder that I have for Gorn, and I could select a battleship graphic for my counter, or I could select a BCH graphic, or War Destroyer graphic, like cruiser graphic, dreadnought graphic, etc. But for now I'm just using a basic color-coded cartoon kind of set of graphics. And I do the same thing for creating a plasma torpedo. And you notice this uses the prototype of weapon instead of prototype of ship. So if I go back up here to prototype of weapon, just the number pad movement, it does a movement trail, it has a spreadsheet, it allows me to clone it, set a label to it, allows me to rotate the piece, basically move it, lets me report it as destroyed, etc. So a lot of these are the same. It's just that later, if I wanted to do certain features that would only affect things that are labeled as prototype ship, but not weapon and not subship, then I could use this type of definition as a discriminator. I'm trying to think ahead for things I could do in the future, kind of thing. But anyway, so I've done the same thing with other counters. Klingon D7. I forget whether or not I have other D7 graphics set up. Which I guess I didn't set up yet. I think I have others for Federation. It's just whatever I had put into the folder at the time. Yeah, so I've got an Excelsior graphic, got a frigate graphic, got a dreadnought graphic, heavy cruiser graphic, etc. NCL graphic, old light cruiser graphic, and I'm just trying to remember where my cartoon graphic was. Federation fast cruiser. Oh, ship A is what I called it. So that's how you would define your playing piece, your counters. And if we look at the pieces list, and if I go back to starships, so there's the Federation CA, there's the Klingon D7, there's a Romulan, and you just grab these pieces and you drag them over onto your playing map kind of thing. And you've got your terrain up here as well. So each one of these pieces of terrain is just a graphic. But once you drag them onto your map, it becomes a playing piece. Now these are the easy things, just creating graphics. But you start to get to more complex things. For instance, here there is a button for Start Here for rules and scenarios, and it's just basically a chart window menu which gives you this button, and then it's a scenario list with a scrollable list of 13 scenarios, and inside each scenario there is an HTML chart which is set up for rules and setup, so that when I open it I get a window with a tab for rules and setup, and here's my list on the side. That's also pretty simple. Here's where things get complicated. So you need to be able to mark damage or record damage on your ship, so there's got to be a starship display. So here's a list of the starships that I've created: Federation, Klingon, Orion, a freighter, etc. So you draw a graphic, and then you import that graphic, and you start defining the traits for that graphic. So here's the basic piece. You can delete it, and then the actual properties of the piece. So with a Starfleet Battles SSD, the things that we're talking about here are things like your shield, your weapons, your hull, transporter, bridge, APR, battery, shuttles, etc. And each one of these things has to be defined as to what it is, where it's located, and what images it's going to go through. So for instance, shield number 1, a 16 point or 16 box shield, you need to give it a layer. So the default layer is the blank undamaged shield, and then every time a keystroke is hit, it will increase to the next layer. Now these could be keyboard shortcuts. For instance, I could say Control Y for increase level and Control U for decrease level, but there are so many boxes that I can't do that, so I had to give them something unique. So luckily I could do SH11, etc. So here it represents shield 1. Originally I was doing 16 individual boxes, so it would be shield 1 box 1, shield 1 box 2, shield 1 box 3, etc. But I found that was too much for the Vassal client engine, so I had to go back and define it as one graphic, and then it would successfully go through 16 different graphics. Now this lets me do it as one layer definition with 16 graphics rather than 16 layers with one graphic. So the number of layers as a trait, as an entry in here, used up a lot more memory than just having it as one layer with 16 graphics apparently. So image 2 is 1 box of damage. That's a separate graphic. Image 3, 2 boxes of damage. It's a separate graphic, etc., etc. Right up to a full 16 boxes of damage on the shield. So every single system has to have multiple graphics, and it's got to have an X coordinate and a Y coordinate. Now this is the definition of the layer. Now the action button is what watches where I'm clicking on the screen. So you have to define what happens. This is the size of the button. The width of the button is 130 pixels by 36 pixels, which is, each box here is roughly about 16 by 16 or 18 by 16, thereabouts. So you get 130 of them wide, and 2 of them is 32 plus a little space for the black line. So it should be 16, double that, 32 plus 2 kind of thing. and then it's got a definition. Now, Vassal uses an XY coordinate system where upwards y is actually negative and to the left x is negative. So to the right x is positive and y positive is down. So this gets a bit reversed in your brain sometimes when you're trying to assign coordinates. It'd be great if I could just simply click, drag to assign the coordinates kind of thing, but it doesn't work that way. You actually literally have to assign like the next coordinate to a y coordinate. So from the center of the graphic, it goes negative 64 pixels. So from the center of the graphic, it goes negative 64. Kind of thing. Or, sorry, from the center of the entire graphic. So it starts at negative 64 from the center of the graphic, and then it starts at negative 218 from the center of the graphic. So basically it defines one point, and then it's the size of the button, which is 130 and 36 from that. So it basically defines, I guess, the top left-hand corner of the shield number 1, and then the button width and height defines how big of a button that is. And it is just one big button. And what happens when you click that button is it executes or invokes this command, sh11. And this description line here can be anything. It's just simply so you know what it is. So if you click within that area, defined by negative 64 and 218, by a width of 130 and a height of 36, it executes command sh11. And if we go back to the layer, sh11 triggers an increase in the graphic level. So it goes from the first graphic to the second graphic. If you click in that area again, it goes to the next graphic. So that's how it changes or applies damage. So that's the layer and the shield add damage button. And for the second one here, it's labeled remove damage. It's the same thing, coordinates, and it's set up as sh-11. And that again is defined in the layer. So if we go back up here, it's sh11, sh-11 for increasing level and decreasing level. Now down here there's a level name. The original graphic I had originally copied for this had a name called checked, and the second one was unchecked because I used an example of a checkbox, which was one box, checked versus unchecked. And then I just changed the graphics, changed the name, changed the location, and just copy pasted for all of it. So I actually had to go back later on and remove the level names for all of these, because when I had the piece in the map, it would say unchecked beside the graphic, and I didn't know where that was coming from. So I had to go back and do this after I had created some 22 ships, each ship containing about some 30 different buttons defined, etc., with layers, and remove them all. Rather annoying. But anyway, and then you go on to the next system. And the next system was shield number 6. And your left warp engine, your right warp engine, and your shuttles, and then you would group certain things into a submenu. So I have shuttle bay damage. So instead of 2 entries, I have 1 entry with a submenu that has 2 entries. So here, for shuttle damage, it brings up add damage to shuttle, remove damage to shuttle, shuttle number 1. Add damage to shuttle number 2, remove damage from shuttle number 2. Rather than having 4 entries here, it's 1 submenu and then it's 4 submenus. Apparently there's a way of doing a spacer. I couldn't figure a way to do it other than putting in another submenu and just leaving the menu blank. Now some systems, like a lab or a transporter, since there's only 2 boxes of it, I didn't need a damage and an undamaged button, and I didn't want to bother to create a submenu to hide them all in, so it's just damage. So if I click lab damage, it damages the lab. If I click it again, it undamages the lab because there's only 1 box. When it comes to the impulse, 1 damage clicks damages the first box, 1 second click damages the second box, a third click goes back to an undamaged box. As you can see, you've got to define each and every system. So each and every system's got like 2 to 3 definitions, and when it comes to the phasers, you've got to define each one separately, kind of thing, because which one gets hit matters. And that's just the one counter, the one SSD. But that's basically all it is. It's defining areas, which are a button. When you click the button, it changes the graphic overlay on top of that. So if I were to remove all of these graphics, or all of these buttons, you still see the ship. But if you were to click on it, it doesn't do anything. It's just a graphic. But by defining the buttons and then rotating the graphics through, you get to see damage applied. For instance, if I do shield number 1, add damage, you get a box. If I do shield number 1, remove damage, it removes it. Now this is just a preview definition window, so I don't have the functionality of clicking, but when you're actually on the game map, you can click and do damage. But in here I've got to use the menu. But that's one game piece. And I've got all of these game pieces defined. So I had to define the X and the Y coordinate and the size of the button for each and every one of them. And unfortunately, it's you got to define the graphic layer for its X and Y coordinate for the layer coordinate, but the action button coordinate is actually shifted because it goes from the center of it, of that graphic layer. So I have to shift that set of coordinates over by 9 and up by 9. So it's not the exact same coordinates, it's a different set of coordinates, and then you got to remember that it's a negative y up and a negative x to the left. And oftentimes I'd be defining the x and the y, and I'd mentally reverse the x, the positive and the negative on that. So I'd be trying to move something to the left and end up moving it to the right, and sometimes I'd move it too far to the right, and then I'd go try and click on it and wouldn't know where the hell the button was, kind of thing. And it took some time to relocate it and get it moved back to where it should be for some systems because of that. And then we have the full-scale SSDs. So that was the Cadet SSD. And then we have the full-scale SSD. And as you can see, there's a lot more boxes, which means bigger buttons with more layers of graphics. And there's more systems. So you've got to take into effect your sensor damage track, your scanner damage track, your damage control repair track, your excess damage track, your probes, your boarding parties. And you don't just have 2 shuttles anymore. Some of these ships have up to 4 shuttles. I did take some liberties where I redesigned the SSDs a bit. Normally on the Federation there'd be a block of forward hull on the left and a block of forward hull on the right, and then you'd have 4 lab on the left, 4 lab on the right. It just made it easier to turn it into one block to define those XY coordinates. Sometimes there'd be 2 battery down in the rear section, 1 or 2 battery up in the top saucer section. Again, I tried to solidify those as much as I can. I couldn't do that with the weapons because the weapons have different arcs, and the positioning on the graphic kind of helps you identify where those arcs are, kind of thing. So I couldn't do that for all the systems, but wherever I could, I grouped the systems together just to make my life easier in defining where these things were. And unfortunately with some ships you can only do that so much. Now once I had the Federation defined, I just simply copied that entry and then renamed it Klingon. But the ships are so different and not everything matches up. So I shifted the graphic around a little bit, trying to keep the shields and the damage control tracks in the same position. Here I ended up pushing the Klingon ship down some, so much so that the number 4 shield is actually within the width of the warp engines, but it works. That was so I could keep the number 1 shield in the same position as the Fed, and the 2 and 6 shields roughly in the same position. Same thing with 3 and 5, but I did have to push them out a little bit to the left and right. And then everything else inside the ship is completely different. It had to be repositioned, but it was easier than recreating each and every entry. I just simply relabeled it or changed the coordinates kind of thing. But there were changes made here as well. For instance, where there's 2 walks here, there's usually 2 impulse, and down here there's usually 2 impulse on the left and 2 impulse on the right, and the APR in between. So I just moved the APR down and combined all the impulse into one rack. In cadet game rules, it's not really going to matter. You don't use boarding party diagrams, so it's not going to make a difference in how the game is played at the cadet level. Now in full game you have catastrophic damage declaration, and the boom section can separate from the rest of the ship and survive an explosion, and then you've got 2 impulse engines and some APR that you can fly off the map with kind of thing. But it really doesn't make a bit of difference in the cadet game because you don't really use those rules, and you're not using boarding party diagrams where you can capture a section of the ship, and the systems that are in that section become unavailable to the player of the ship. So it didn't matter where the impulse was located. So minor changes like that were made. But as it is, the Federation, the Klingon, and the Orion, those 3 full-sized SSDs, are pushing the Vassal client to its limits. Let's just count how long it takes to go from one click to another right here in this little screen. Click 1,000, 2, 1,000, yeah, almost 2 seconds. 1,000, 2, yeah. Before I did those 3 SSDs, this was click, 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 and it would move and snap. Now if I try and double click on something to open it, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000, 5, 1,000, 6, 1,000, 7, 1,000, 8, 1,000, about 9-10 seconds before it pops up and open. So the number of layers that I'm using and the number of graphics that I'm using to define these ships is really pushing the Vassal client to its maximum. So it's kind of lucky that we're limited to only these 3 full-size ships, because I think if I had to put in the other 7 or 8 full-size ships that were included in the cadet module, it would be too much for the Vassal engine as it exists currently in the way that it handles the damage graphically kind of thing. I'm sure that if I knew Java and did an importation of a Java class, that I could probably do what I'm doing graphically with lines of code and text and be much, much, much smaller memory-wise and processing-wise. But as it is with my skill level, it's pushing it. So you've got that with your SSDs for all of your races. And then we've got the impulse chart. So the cadet game uses the 8 impulse chart, a 16 impulse chart, and a 32 impulse chart. And basically, it echoes into the chat window the calls. So we have to define what each of these are. So this is an 8 impulse. How many turns it covers. So the start value is 1, it increments by 1. It's an 8 impulse turn. And then we have the movements that occur on each of those impulses. So each turn has 8 impulses. Impulses 1 through 8, and on specific impulses, specific speeds move. And then within those subpulses, you have the various steps. So you've got a terrain movement of ships, cloaking and decloaking, tractor, launch, ESGs, lowering your shields, raising them again, Saltorian firing their shield cracker weapons, operation of transporters, declaring emergency deceleration, doing dogfights with fighters, landing your shuttles, launching your shuttles, launching or laying mines from your shuttle bays, firing your direct fire weapons, and Tholian web solidifying. That's what happens each and every impulse. And then you have 8 impulses to a turn, and then you increase your turns, turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, turn 4, and that's how all that occurs. So you have to define this for each and every one of your movement charts. And then again, the same thing for your 32 impulse chart. When you get your 32, it's the same steps for each impulse, but now instead of 8 or 16, you have 32 impulses. So your movement lists get bigger. So on impulse 2, there's a lot more speeds that get called to move. So what you're seeing here text-wise is the same thing as this chart graphically. So there are 32 impulses to a turn, and your ship can be going from speed 0 up to speed 32. The chart here starts at speed 2 because speed 1 is going to move on the last impulse. So it would just be another column here with one item. And speed 0, you don't move, so no need to list it on the map. So on, for instance, impulse 8, speed's 32, down to 24 move, but 23 doesn't. Speed 22 is down to 20 move, speed 19 doesn't, etc., etc. So here on impulse 8, you got the same thing as text. And that will appear in your chat window. So either you can keep the window open for the graphic and look at it graphically, or you can click the button in here and have this pop up. And then you have to define your scenarios. So that's where the save file is. And then you have your charts. So you can create an info table chart window. Inside that, you've got options for adding a chart, an HTML chart, a tab panel, etc., pull down menu, scrollable list, or even another map. So inside that, you've again got a similar list. Until finally you get to an entry. So here, the entry is a chart, and the chart is a graphic. So you create your graphic in another program like GIMP or Photoshop or whatever paint program you use kind of thing, and then you import it inside your charts. And that ends up making your info tables where I've got movement, damage, transporters, cloak charts, and inside, for instance, weapons, you've got a weapon sheet, a plasma sheet, a firing arc sheet, etc. So here is your firing arc sheet, and it just refers to a graphic. So it defines a button, info tables, which is here, And when you click that Info Tables button, you get this window. And inside that, you have Weapons, Movement, Damage, Transport, Cloak, which is the same thing as over here. Weapons, Movement, Damage, Transport, Cloak. And then under Weapons, for instance, you get all of these, which are all these buttons across the top. And when you click on the button, it displays the graphic. And then you got your little definition of your dice. So we use D6s in SFB. So 1d6, 2d6, and 10 if you want to throw a bunch at once. Those are the labels. And up here you actually got to define your dice. So 1d6, the graphic for it, the number of dice, the number of sides per dice, and if you were defining a dice for a specific type of character, let's say it's a D&D type game and every time you swing an axe you can create a button for a magic axe and it's got a +3 to the roll kind of thing. So you can add a +3 here kind of thing. Or if you define it as 5d6 and then you could add to the overall total sort of thing. So that's how you would set up your dice. And I think I've already shown you the rules and scenarios. Yep. So once you've defined all of these things, suddenly you've got yourself a game. So we can do something like Scenario 7. If I want to add a piece to the game, I click Pieces. If I want to add it as a starship, I go to the race. I grab the piece I want, drag it onto the map. If I want to go to the scenario, I get the scenario rules and setup information here. So we loaded up Scenario 7, so if I go here to Scenario 7, these are the rules that you need to learn for Scenario 7, which are in addition to the rules that you learned through each successive scenario. And here is the setup rules. So this is meant to be played with full-scale ships, but I set it up so you can play it with cadet ships first. And it's the same thing as Scenario 5, except you're using the Commander's SSDs, the full-size ships, instead of the cadet ships. And it's a Federation versus Klingon fight using the 32 impulse chart. So we don't need that Lyran graphic that I just put on here, so let's get rid of that. And if I reduce the size of the map here down to 50%, we can see that my Federation counters are up here on the right, the Klingon counters are down here on the left, and then we've got the full-scale SSD sheets for the Federation and the Klingon here. So now let's just go back into 100%. And 100% is just a little bit too much to have the entire sheet, so let's try 70%. And we can do better than that. Let's try 80%. Now we can probably get away with 90 maybe. There, so you can see the entire ship if you want it on screen all at once. But let's just go back to 100. You'll notice that the graphics got a bit of shadowing when it wasn't set at 100%. Unfortunately, it does that. And there is a mouse over that gives you a zoom window, and right now I've just got that left at 100%. It could be zooming to 200% or zooming at 50%. I'm actually going to try and get rid of that later. I just got to find out where it's at. But then you've got an SSD sheet that you can use. So I want to damage the number 2 shield by 5 points of damage. I just click 5 times in that area, and it will apply the 5 points of damage. Now, there is a slowness delay for these full-sized ships, which you'll just have to put up with. Again, it's because we are pushing the client to the maximum. So let's see how much of a delay we got here. So let me put 10 points on the number 6 shield. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 1,000. 2, 1,000. 3, 1,000. 4, 1,000. 5, 1,000. 6, 1,000. 7, 1,000. 8, 1,000. 9, 1,000. 10, 1,000. 11, 1,000. 12, 1,000. 13, 1,000. 14, 1,000. 15, 1,000. 16, 1,000. So it's 16 seconds to apply 10 points of damage. It's a bit much for a delay, but it'll work. You're just not going to go fast. Now, if you're just applying 1 point of damage, 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, that's about a 2-second delay. And for the most part, you're only going to be applying 1 or 2 points of damage. It's going to be kind of rare that you blow away an entire shield. But for instance, this is a 30-point shield. You don't have to click 30 times to blow away the entire shield. Again, this rotates through graphics. Sorry about that mouse over, it keeps popping up. What I've done for large blocks like this is the label is an undo button. So for instance, if I want to blow away that entire number 5 shield, I can just click in the undo, and it rotates to the last graphic, which is the entire shield damaged. Same thing with your right warp engine, for instance. Just click on the damage or undo damage button, and it rotates to the last graphic. Now if I were to click inside this button, it advances it and it rotates back to the first graphic, and the first graphic was undamaged. So it rotates in sequence. Click on it 2 times, get 2 damage. If you want to undo the 2 damage, click on the label, 1, 2, and it will undo the 2 damage. So that's how that works. And you can mark a drone being used. You can change the status of a shuttle if it's a manned shuttle versus it being a wild weasel versus it being a suicide shuttle by clicking on the notes. You can damage a shuttle by clicking on the hit point boxes. And you can undo the damage by clicking here to the left under the ident. Because that's where the label would normally be on a paper SSD. You would label it shuttle number 1, etc. But that undoes the damage. And if you want to kill the entire shuttle one shot, you just go click on the ident when there's no damage, and it hits all 6. So that's how you end up playing with the SSD for applying damage. So if you know the rules of Starfleet battles, you know how to maneuver your ship. If you want to roll 3 dice for firing 3 phasers, click dice, d6, dice, d6, dice, d6. And if I scroll this chat window down area a little bit, I rolled a 6, a 2, and a 1. So I go to my weapons chart. Let's say that was phaser 1s at a range of 5. Well, 6 does 2. 2 does 4. So that's 6 so far. And a 1 does 5. So that's 11 damage. And then I would go to the SSD. Let's say that was the Klingon firing at the Federation. And then I would click here 11 times. And it would apply the 11 boxes. So again, you're going to do about a 10-second delay for every 16 boxes. So I just clicked 16 times in a row. So you're going to have a few seconds delay here where the client's going to be a little bit unresponsive. But then it will eventually, sorry, I'm scrolling up and down here, apply all of the damage. And there we go. We have a playable game. And that's the Vassal engine. Can't think of anything else to show you on how I made it right yet. So basically you have a lot of work creating your graphics, and you have a lot of work defining your layers and action buttons and trigger buttons and what those do. This isn't an automated game, it's pretty much manual. Now I could, for instance, do a lot more programming here, or I could integrate the range between this counter and that counter, and I could define the fact that I'm firing 3 phasers, and it could then automatically do the dice rolls, and then automatically apply those bits of damage to the graphic. And if it was doing internal damage, it could automatically pull up the damage allocation chart and do the rolls for the damage allocation chart, and then automatically apply the hits to the forward hull, and phaser hits to the phasers, etc. So that could all be automated, because some of that has been automated, for instance, in Starfleet Battles Online. But I fear that it's a little bit beyond my programming skills. It would need the importation of Java classes, I believe, for a lot of it. And I suspect that when it comes to the full-size SSDs, it would probably push the client to its maximum, and it may actually even be too much for the client. But that's with the full-size SSDs. If we just jump back to the setup here where I've got 2 Cadet SSDs. I think I scrolled right by them. Here, let's go small so I can see where I've put them. No, they're on the right hand side. So here, if I want to apply 7 or 8 points of damage, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 1000, 2, 1000, all 7 pop up. So the more button areas that are defined, and the more graphics that it has to rotate through, the more of a delay you get. When it comes to these cadet ships, the Vassal engine is, for the size of the SSDs that I've created so far, it's very responsive. No delay. But as you saw with the full-size SSDs, there's so many overlays that it does bog it down. And even though these are pretty large ships, they're not the largest ships in Starfleet Battles. If I were to put a starbase up here or a battleship, just the one SSD, I fear, would slow the client down enormously. And then if we were to try and do a game of, say, 12 ships, 12 cruisers versus 12 cruisers, maybe around a starbase, maybe with a planet with ground defense phaser installations on the planet, adding to all of the SSDs that are in play, I think it would probably crash the client, unless it was reprogrammed using imported Java classes. It would just be too much for it. But you can do a hell of a lot with this client as it is. And that's how I've put together the Cadet module for Starfleet Battles. If you have any other specific questions, I can answer them in the next video. But at the moment, I can't think of anything else. So, have a good day.